Still, when the entire kitchen staff had already gone quiet, a boy in a hand-me-down school uniform stood in the middle of the restaurant floor holding his mother's apron, tears streaking down his face, looking up at a stranger in an expensive coat who had just walked in and asked to see whoever was in charge. Nobody in the room knew yet that the man standing by the door was about to become the answer to that question. The boy did not know it either. All he knew was that his mother had been crying in the back office for 20 minutes, and that crying, in his experience, usually meant something was about to be taken away. The boy's name was Matteo. He was 9 years old. His mother, Carmen, had worked as the head server at Rosalina's, a small family-style Italian restaurant that had sat on the corner of the same street for 18 years, for the last 6 of those years. She had started as a busser, worked her way up through every position in the front of house, and had become, by the time Matteo was old enough to understand what work meant, the person the entire restaurant quietly ran on, the one who remembered every regular's order, who trained every new hire, who stayed late without being asked when someone called in sick. Before we go any further, if you believe that loyalty deserves to be seen, and that the people who quietly hold a place together are often the ones most at risk of being overlooked, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that decency still shows up in the most unexpected places. Now, back to the story. Rosalina's had been struggling for the better part of a year. The original owner, an elderly man named Frank Rosalina, who had built the place with his late wife decades earlier, had finally decided to sell after his health made it impossible to keep running the business himself. For months, rumors had circulated among the staff about who might buy it, and each rumor came with its own particular fear, because everyone knew that a new owner meant new decisions, and new decisions, in restaurants especially, often meant a clean sweep of the staff who had built the place's reputation but did not appear on paper to be essential. That afternoon, Carmen had been called into the back office by the outgoing manager, a nervous, apologetic man named Doug, who had been tasked with handling the transition, and told that the incoming ownership group's initial review of staffing had flagged her position, along with several others, for what the paperwork coldly called restructuring. Doug had not enjoyed delivering the news. He had worked with Carmen for years and knew, better than most, exactly how much of the restaurant's daily function depended on her, but the decision, he explained, had come from above, from people who had not yet even walked through the door, people evaluating spreadsheets rather than the actual humans who kept the numbers on those spreadsheets afloat in the first place. Carmen had gone into the back office to gather herself, and Matteo, who had been doing his homework at his usual corner table near the kitchen the way he did most afternoons after school while his mother finished her shift, had overheard enough of the conversation through the thin office door to understand the shape of what was happening, even if he did not understand every detail. He understood the word restructuring. He understood, more importantly, the sound of his mother crying quietly behind a door she thought was fully closed. It was at that exact moment that Julian Marchetti Voss walked through the front doors of Rosalina's for the first time. Julian was 34 years old, the founder of a small but rapidly growing hospitality group that had, over the past 5 years, quietly acquired and revitalized a handful of struggling neighborhood restaurants across the city, always with the same philosophy that had made him something of an outlier among his investor peers. Buy the building, but build the future around the people already inside it, not despite them. He had grown up the son of restaurant workers himself, his mother a line cook and his father a dishwasher for most of Julian's childhood. And he had never forgotten what it felt like to be the kid doing homework at the corner table, while a parent finished a shift, the exact position Matteo was sitting in at that very moment. He had come to Rosalina's that day for what was supposed to be a quiet, unannounced walkthrough. The kind he preferred to do before any staff knew who he was, because he had learned over the years that the way a restaurant treated its people when nobody important was watching told him far more than any financial report ever could. He was not planning to introduce himself yet. He was planning to simply observe. His plan changed the moment Matteo approached him. The boy had not known, could not have known, that the man in the expensive coat standing near the entrance was the very person responsible for the restructuring decision that had just made his mother cry. All Matteo knew was that this was clearly someone important, someone dressed the way people dressed on the rare occasions his mother described as when the owners come by, and something in him, some fierce, protective instinct that had been building over the last 20 minutes of listening to his mother cry through a door, pushed him forward before he had fully decided to move. He walked up to Julian, small, and determined, still clutching his mother's spare apron that had been hanging on a hook near the coat rack, and looked up at him with the kind of directness that only children who have not yet learned to be intimidated by adults in expensive coats can manage. "Please don't fire my mom," Mateo said, his voice cracking halfway through the sentence. "She's the best server here. She's worked here since I was 3. She trained almost everybody in the kitchen. She never calls in sick, not even when I was sick, because she said the restaurant needed her. Please, I don't know what we'll do if she loses this job." Julian Voss, a man who had sat through countless boardroom negotiations without so much as a flicker of visible emotion, felt something in his chest tighten in a way that caught him entirely off guard. He knelt down, not out of performance, but because some instinct told him that towering over this boy would only make the moment worse, and asked him gently what his mother's name was. "Carmen," Mateo said. "Carmen Reyes. She's in the back office. Please, sir, whoever you are, please just talk to her before you decide anything. She loves this place. She loves it more than anybody." Before we continue, we want to pause here, because what Mateo did not yet understand was that the man kneeling in front of him was not simply a customer or a random visitor who might pass along a kind word to management. He was the decision itself, standing there in a wool coat, listening to a 9-year-old beg for his mother's job, without any idea that the person he was begging had the actual power, in that very moment, to change everything. Julian stood up slowly, thanked Mateo for talking to him, and asked if he could meet Carmen. Mateo, relieved that someone important seemed to be taking him seriously, led him straight to the back office and knocked gently on the door. Carmen opened it, her eyes red, quickly wiping her face and straightening her posture the way people do when they are trying to hide that they have been crying in front of someone they assume is a stranger. She recognized immediately, from Doug's earlier description of the incoming ownership walkthrough, exactly who this well-dressed man likely was, and her stomach dropped even further, assuming her son had somehow made things worse by approaching him directly. "I'm so sorry," she started, glancing at Mateo. "He shouldn't have bothered you, sir. I'll speak with him about—" "He didn't bother me," Julian said. "He told me about you, all of it. I'd like to hear the rest from you, if that's all right." What followed was a conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours, first in the back office, and then, once the dinner rush began building, at the corner table where Mateo usually did his homework, Julian insisting on staying to watch Carmen work an actual shift rather than simply take her word or Doug's word for what she brought to the restaurant. He watched her manage 4 tables at once, without ever losing her warmth. Watched her quietly correct a new server's mistake, without embarrassing him in front of a table. Watched her stop mid-stride to crouch down and talk to an elderly regular's grandchild about the drawing the child was working on at the table. The same unhurried, genuine attention Julian himself remembered his own mother giving to customers decades earlier, back when he was the kid at the corner table. By the end of the night, Julian had made his decision, though it was not the decision the restructuring spreadsheet had originally suggested. He did not just reverse Carmen's termination. He offered her the position of general manager, a role with real authority over hiring, scheduling, and daily operations, a role that came with a salary nearly double what she had been making, because he had watched her, for one full shift, effectively run half the restaurant's floor operations without the title or the pay to reflect it. And he had decided he would rather build the future of Rosalina's around someone who already knew, in her bones, exactly what the place needed to survive. Carmen, stunned, asked him why. Julian told her the truth, the same truth he would later tell his own business partners when they questioned why he had scrapped a portion of the original restructuring plan after a single walkthrough. He said that spreadsheets could tell you what a position cost, but they could never tell you what a person was worth, and that the only way to learn the difference was to actually watch someone work, actually listen to the people who loved them enough to beg a stranger on their behalf. Mateo, sitting quietly at the corner table through most of this conversation, only fully understood what had happened when his mother knelt down in front of him afterward, tears streaming down her face again, but entirely different tears this time, and told him that not only did she still have her job, she had a better one than she had ever imagined possible, and that none of it would have happened if he had not been brave enough to walk up to a stranger and ask for what mattered most to him. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the people who made Mateo capable of that courage in the first place, because bravery like his rarely comes from nowhere. A third-grade teacher named Mrs. Okonkwo, who had spent the year teaching her class that speaking up for people you love was never something to be ashamed of, even when your voice shakes while you do it. Carmen herself, who had modeled for her son every single day of his life what it looked like to show up fully for the people and places you care about, even when nobody was watching or thanking you for it. And Doug, the outgoing manager who, despite having to deliver the original bad news, had quietly told Mateo earlier that afternoon, sensing the boy's distress, that sometimes the people who matter most are the ones worth fighting hardest for. None of them were in that dining room during Mateo's exact moment of courage. All of them were. In the months that followed, Rosalina's underwent a transformation that surprised even the staff who had worked there for years. Julian did not gut the restaurant's identity the way so many new ownership groups did with the neighborhood places they acquired. He kept the recipes Frank Rosalina had built the menu around, updating only what needed genuine improvement. He kept nearly the entire original staff, restructuring not by cutting people, but by finally giving titles and fair pay to the people who had, for years, been doing far more than their job descriptions technically required. Carmen, as general manager, brought a warmth to the operational side of the business that made the restaurant not just survive under new ownership, but genuinely thrive, reservations climbing steadily as word spread that Rosalina's still felt exactly like the place people remembered, just somehow, impossibly, even better. Mateo became something of an unofficial fixture at the restaurant during this period, no longer just doing homework quietly at a corner table, but gradually, as he got a little older, learning small tasks around the front of house on weekends, rolling silverware, greeting regulars by name the way his mother had taught him, absorbing the same values of attentiveness and care that had once saved his mother's job in the first place. Julian, who visited Rosalina's regularly even as his hospitality group continued expanding to other struggling neighborhood restaurants, made a point of always stopping by Mateo's corner table when he came in, asking about school, about homework, about whatever book he was currently reading, the same unhurried attention he had first noticed Carmen give to every customer who sat at her tables. 2 years after that first conversation, on the restaurant's 20th anniversary, Frank Rosalina himself, now retired and in frail health, came back for the celebration, moved nearly to tears at how little had actually changed despite the new ownership, how the same warmth he and his late wife had built the place around all those years ago was still, somehow, fully intact. Carmen gave a short speech that evening, and near the end of it, she asked Mateo to stand up beside her, telling the room, many of whom did not know the full story, that if it were not for her son's courage on an ordinary Tuesday 2 years earlier, none of them would be standing in this room celebrating anything at all. Julian, watching from a table near the back, found himself thinking, not for the first time, about his own mother, about the corner table he had once done his homework at as a child in a restaurant kitchen very much like this one, and about how strange and quietly wonderful it was that the same instinct that had once made him build his entire career around protecting people like her had led him, one ordinary afternoon, straight to a 9-year-old boy brave enough to ask a stranger for exactly what his family needed most. The night before Mateo's 12th birthday, he sat with his mother in their now considerably more comfortable apartment and asked her, almost shyly, whether she thought Julian would come to his party. Carmen smiled and told him that Julian had already asked weeks earlier whether he could bring a cake, because he wanted to make sure he had told her that he never missed a single birthday of the boy who had once looked up at a stranger in an expensive coat and, without knowing anything about who that stranger really was, found the courage to ask for exactly what mattered most. In the weeks following that first walkthrough, Julian found himself returning to Rosalina's far more often than his schedule technically allowed, and his business partners, reviewing his calendar, began to notice a pattern they had not seen from him with any of his other acquisitions. He was not simply overseeing an investment. He was, in some quiet way, none of them fully understood at first, working through something personal every time he walked through those doors. His childhood had not been an easy one. His mother, Rosa, had worked the line at a diner for most of his early years, coming home most nights smelling of grease and exhaustion, and his father, a dishwasher at the same diner, had worked equally long hours for equally modest pay. Julian remembered, with a clarity that surprised him even now, the particular fear that used to settle over their small apartment whenever rumors circulated about new ownership at the diner, the same restructuring fear he had watched play out at Rosalina's the day he met Mateo. He remembered his mother once losing a shift she desperately needed because a new manager had decided, based on nothing but a glance at a schedule, that her position was expendable. He had been 8 years old at the time, close in age to Mateo, and he had never forgotten the helplessness of being too young to do anything but watch. He had built his entire hospitality group in many ways as a quiet correction to that helplessness, a business built on the belief that the people actually running a restaurant's daily operations deserved more say in their own futures than any spreadsheet alone could offer them. Meeting Matteo, hearing a 9-year-old say almost exactly what Julian himself had once wished he could say on his own mother's behalf decades earlier, had struck him with a force he had not expected walking through the door that afternoon. Carmen's transition into her new role as general manager was not without its own challenges. She had spent 6 years as a server, skilled and beloved by regulars, but stepping into a position of real authority over scheduling, hiring, and budget required a different set of skills entirely, ones she had never been given the formal opportunity to develop. Julian, rather than simply handing her the title and leaving her to sink or swim, arranged for her to work alongside an experienced operations consultant named Priyanka for several months, someone who had helped several of his other acquired restaurants through similar transitions. Priyanka did not treat Carmen as someone who needed to be taught from scratch, but as someone who already understood the restaurant intuitively and simply needed the technical vocabulary and systems to match that intuition. By the end of the first quarter under her management, Rosalina's had its most profitable stretch in nearly 5 years, not because Carmen had learned to think like a spreadsheet, but because the spreadsheet had finally caught up to what she had always known about running the floor. Matteo's role at the restaurant grew slowly and organically over the following 2 years, never pushed on him, always offered. He started by simply rolling silverware on Saturday afternoons, delighted by the small responsibility of it, and gradually took on greeting regulars, learning names and usual orders the way he had watched his mother do for years. A longtime regular named Mr. Halloran, a retired postal worker who had been coming to Rosalina's every Sunday for over a decade, took a particular liking to Matteo, always saving him a seat at the counter to talk about baseball while he waited for his usual order, and Matteo, who had grown up without much extended family nearby, found in those Sunday conversations something that felt, quietly, like having a grandfather. Julian made a point, whenever his schedule allowed, of joining Matteo and Mr. Halloran at the counter, and it was during one of these Sunday conversations, nearly a year and a half after their first meeting, that Julian told Matteo the full story of his own mother, of the shift she had lost when he was 8 years old, of the helplessness he had carried for years afterward. Matteo listened the way he always did, fully present, and told Julian, with the same directness that had first caught Julian's attention outside the back office, that he was glad Julian had grown up to make sure it never happened to anyone else's mom again, at least not on his watch. Frank Rosalina, the restaurant's original owner, visited more frequently than anyone expected once word spread through the neighborhood about how little had actually changed under the new ownership. On one visit, sitting with Carmen in the back office that had once delivered such devastating news, he told her that he had sold the restaurant with a quiet fear that he was betraying everything he and his late wife had built it around, and that watching her run the floor now, watching Matteo greet regulars by name the way Frank himself used to, had finally let him retire without that fear following him. There was one detail Carmen never told Matteo directly, though he pieced it together on his own years later. On the same afternoon Julian had first walked through the doors, before Matteo ever approached him, Doug had already warned Julian, in a quiet aside meant to manage expectations, that letting go of positions like Carmen's would be difficult but necessary. That sentiment could not run a business, and that the outgoing owner's soft spot for longtime staff was part of why the restaurant had struggled financially in recent years. Julian had nodded along politely at the time, not yet certain whether he agreed, still forming his own read of the situation. It was Matteo's interruption, arriving at almost the exact moment Julian was weighing that advice against his own instincts, that had tipped the scale entirely. Doug, to his credit, never resented being proven wrong. He stayed on for another year to help with the transition, and later told Carmen, half joking, that he considered Matteo the best negotiator he had ever watched work a room. Age 9, no training, no leverage beyond an apron and the truth. By the time of the restaurant's 20th anniversary celebration, Julian's hospitality group had grown to include 6 restaurants across the city, each one acquired with the same philosophy he had first fully committed to inside Rosalina's, though he often told people, when asked which acquisition mattered most to him, that none of the others had ever quite matched the particular clarity of that first afternoon. kneeling down to listen to a 9-year-old boy who had no idea he was talking to the exact person who could grant his one request. Mateo, now 11, had started keeping a small notebook of his own, inspired partly by watching his mother manage the restaurant, and partly by the stories Julian occasionally told him about growing up in his own family's diner. In it, he wrote down small things he noticed about how people worked, how regulars liked their coffee, which servers seemed tired and might need an extra hand, the kind of quiet attentiveness that Julian recognized, with something between pride and nostalgia, as the exact same instinct that had once made Carmen indispensable to a business that almost failed to see her value on paper. Never underestimate what a child will do for someone they love. Never assume that the people quietly holding a place together are the ones easiest to replace. Never forget that courage does not require knowing exactly who you are speaking to, only knowing exactly what you are willing to fight for. And never forget that sometimes the most important business decision a person will ever make is not found in a spreadsheet at all, but in the willingness to kneel down, listen to a 9-year-old, and actually watch the person he is defending before deciding anything at all. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about the moment that touched you most, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that speaking up for the people we love is always worth the shaking voice it sometimes takes. Subscribe for more stories about courage, loyalty, and the quiet decisions that end up changing everything. Because sometimes the bravest voice in the room belongs to the smallest person in it, and sometimes the person with the power to help you has been standing closer than you ever imagined.